The Lone Star State, a place of beauty, charm, and darkness. You're about to hear stories that'll make your skin crawl, about the monsters that hid in plain sight. Prepare to meet the Texas serial killers, their chilling motives, and the haunting scars they left on the state. You won't sleep soundly after this. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing, and by doing so, they miss out on the creepiest, spine-tingling tales that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now. Because tonight's just the beginning, and the terror waiting in the darkness is far from over. So, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments, because here, the night is only getting started and the horror is waiting to unfold. Now, let's dive into the darkness. It was almost funny at first, almost charming. Dean Corll was the guy who handed out free candy at the factory his family ran in Pasadena, Texas. Kids would walk by, and he'd wave them in with that calm, crooked smile. He gave out salt water, taffy, jawbreakers, peanut clusters, the old-fashioned kind that stuck to the roof of your mouth and made you feel like everything in the world was still sweet and simple. People said he was quiet, polite, a little strange maybe, but nothing
alarming.
He lived in his mother's old house and kept to himself. No criminal record, no outbursts, no warning signs. He didn't drink much, didn't raise his voice, didn't have many friends. Just that smile, that same damn smile that never quite reached his eyes. But that smile was the mask, and behind it lived something Texas had never seen before, something it still has nightmares about. From 1970 to 1973, teenage boys started disappearing around Houston and Pasadena. Some of them were labeled runaways. Some of them were never even reported missing. Poor kids, latchkey kids, boys no one would notice until it was too late. Corll had help. That was the part no one wanted to believe. Two teenage boys, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. He met them when they were just kids themselves. He groomed them, bought them things, treated them like sons, then slowly twisted their minds into something colder, something cruel. He promised them money, let them party at his place. He told them they were special, gave them drugs, showed them the kind of power a weak man craves when he has nothing else. And together, they started hunting. Corll would send the boys out to find new victims. Teenage boys, just like them. Friends, classmates, strangers. They'd offer a ride, or booze, or a safe place to sleep. Some of the victims thought they were being saved. Some were just looking for a good time. Some were probably running from something worse at home. None of them made it out. Corll's house became the trap, just a simple little house with faded paint and cheap curtains. But inside, God help them. Inside it was a place built for pain. The torture board was in the back room. A large piece of plywood, holes drilled through the corners, ropes attached. The walls were soundproofed, or maybe the neighbors just didn't care. One boy was kept alive for 4 days. 4 days of horror. 4 days of screaming into a pillow until his throat bled. 4 days of Corll, quiet as always, methodically breaking him down like a butcher cleaning a deer. He didn't just kill them. That would have been too kind. Corll raped them, tortured them, beat them until their bodies shut down. He experimented. He used surgical tools. Some boys were drugged. Some were gagged so tightly their lips turned blue. Some were strangled. Others shot. And some were buried alive. And the whole time, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley helped, watched, held the boys down, sometimes participated. Later, Henley said Corll made him believe it was necessary, that it was just what men did. The bodies didn't stay in the house. No, Corll had a plan for those too. He wrapped them in plastic, sometimes in sheets, sometimes nothing at all. Then he buried them. Some went beneath the floor of a dusty old boat shed Corll had rented off Silver Bell Street. Others were dumped along High Island Beach or buried in the woods. He buried them like trash, like bones meant to be forgotten. But they weren't forgotten. One of the victims, a boy no older than 15, was allowed to write a note, just once. One chance to say something before the end. He wrote, "Mama, I'm sorry." That note was found years later, and the ink had started to fade. But the pain in it was fresh. That boy died begging for forgiveness for something he didn't do. Like it was his fault for trusting someone who smiled too wide and talked too soft. Coral didn't kill for money. He didn't kill out of rage. He killed because it gave him control. He killed because it made him feel like God. And when he was finished, he wiped his hands, poured himself a drink, and turned on the radio like it was just another Tuesday night. But like all monsters, he made a mistake. In August of 1973, Henley brought two friends over to Coral's house, a boy and a girl. Coral hadn't hurt a girl before. That wasn't part of his ritual. He got angry, screamed at Henley, said the girl had to die. That was the moment something inside Henley cracked. They argued. Coral threw him against the wall, said he was going to kill him, too. Henley picked up a pistol, a small .22 revolver. Coral called his bluff. Henley pulled the trigger 6 times. Coral hit the ground and didn't move. And that's how the whole thing came undone. Henley confessed everything. He sat down with police and told them where the bodies were. And when they started digging under that boat shed, the smell hit them first. That thick, rotting, sweet smell that makes grown men vomit. What they found didn't make sense to the human mind. 28 bodies. Some wrapped, some not. Some boys still wearing the shirts they'd disappeared in. Skulls crushed, bones broken, teeth scattered like seeds in the dirt. They found a ring, a shoe, a belt with a name etched into it. One mother collapsed when she saw it. Another refused to believe it. Said her boy was still out there. Had to be. Said she'd seen him in a dream. The dream stopped after the bones were returned. The story didn't end with Coral's death. It echoed. It stayed in the soil. It crawled into the walls of every house within 10 miles of that boat shed. People started locking their doors, started warning their kids about nice men. Some parents never smiled again. Some marriages didn't survive the grief. Some people moved away and never said why. To this day, no one knows if it was just 28. Some believe there were more. There's talk of a 30th body, one that was never recovered. A boy who was never reported missing. A boy whose ghost still walks the neighborhood, looking for a way home. Dean Coral was buried in a pauper's grave. No headstone, no flowers, just dirt. But the stain he left on Texas has never washed away. They called him the Candy Man, but candy melts, and what Dean Coral left behind never did. That's how it always starts, doesn't it? The neighbors, the co-workers, the old ladies down the street, they always say the same thing after the bodies turn up and the news vans start circling. He seemed polite, but Charles Albright was more than that. He was intelligent, charming even, neat to the point of obsession. Former school teacher, amateur painter, he had a bachelor's degree in teaching, a minor in art, and a fondness for classical music and science books. To the world, he was a man with hobbies and habits. To Dallas, especially the parts of it where women sold their bodies to survive, he was something much worse. He was a collector. The trouble began in late '90, but nobody put the puzzle together until it was far too late. At first, it was just one woman. Then another. Prostitutes, all of them, working the same bad streets, Harry Hines Boulevard, Oak Cliff, Pleasant Grove, places where the dark crept in early and never really left. They were found discarded like trash, thrown into alleys, overgrown lots, back roads where the grass grew higher than the guardrails. Some had been beaten, some raped, but all of them had one thing in common. Their eyes were gone, not gouged, not ripped, removed surgically. Clean cuts, little to no bleeding, as if someone had known exactly where to cut, exactly how deep, exactly what to leave behind. Detectives called in medical experts. A surgeon? No. A mortician? Unlikely. Whoever was doing this had experience with anatomy, but not in a hospital setting. The precision was there, but it was off in a way that was more personal, intimate. And then there was what wasn't left behind. No fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers. It was as if the killer had drifted in and out like a fog. The women were just gone, until they weren't. Then came the paintings he'd always painted, even as a boy. Teachers remembered him sketching eyes during class. Hundreds of them, lining the edges of his notebooks like tiny windows into something wrong. After he was kicked out of Arkansas State for stealing tools, scalpels, textbooks, he never really stopped drawing. And as he got older, the paintings grew more lifelike, more uncanny. The eyes were always the best part. Too detailed, too human. They didn't shimmer like paint. They stared. Back in 1965, he'd been arrested for molesting a girl. He was 25, she was 9. They gave him probation, slap on the wrist. That's how the system worked back then. Or didn't. Over the years, he got caught for other things. Petty theft, forging checks, breaking and entering. But he never stayed in jail long. He was clever, and people liked him. The kind of man who helped his neighbors fix their broken fences and volunteered to walk dogs for the elderly. You could trust Charlie. That's what made him dangerous. By the time the third body showed up, Shirley Williams, the city started to realize this wasn't just bad luck or turf violence. She'd been dumped behind an elementary school, her face mutilated, her nose crushed, one eye missing entirely. The other had been removed with the same surgical skill. The city shuddered, and in the dark corners of Dallas the girls began to whisper. "There's a man out there," they said. "A quiet man. A man with glasses who doesn't blink when you say no. A man who stares too long. A man who takes you home and you never come back, but the streets don't carry much weight in courtrooms." So the killer kept killing. Then came Veronica. She didn't die. She was young, strung out, half-starved and used to bad nights, but the one she spent with Charles Albright nearly broke her. She came crawling out of an abandoned house on Eagle Ford Road, bleeding, hysterical, and half-naked, muttering about a man with calm hands and a voice like a teacher, a man who smiled while he tied her down, a man who whispered facts about human anatomy while tracing her eyelids with his thumb. Her testimony cracked the case open like an old coffin. Police searched Charlie's home. What they found was worse than anyone expected. Anatomy textbooks, medical journals, surgical tools cleaned and labeled, a refrigerator with small containers of preserved tissue, hundreds of photographs, faces of women frozen in fear, mouths open in screams, eyes wide. The walls were covered in portraits. Women, and always, always those eyes. The paintings didn't just watch you. They remembered you. They followed you from one side of the room to the other, not like works of art, but like witnesses. Some officers said they felt sick just being in that house. Others claimed they heard whispers coming from behind the canvas. One man never painted again after what he saw. Another took a medical leave and never returned to the force. In 1991, Charles Albright was arrested and charged with murder. He pled not guilty, claimed he was being framed, but the evidence was overwhelming. The scalpel marks, the photos, the eyewitness accounts, the physical matches. They only convicted him for one murder, Mary Lou Pratt's, because the justice system is a strange and often disappointing machine. But the world knew. The media called him the eyeball killer. He died in 2020 in a prison cell, alone, half-blind from cataracts and age. Some say he kept painting up until the very end, that he'd stare at his cell walls and whisper, "Hold still now, just a moment more." But the story didn't end with his death. The few people who still own his paintings, pieces that Passed hands at auctions and estate sales, kept in attics or thrift shops, say the same thing. The eyes still watch. They follow. They stare. And sometimes, just sometimes, they blink. Before Jack the Ripper ever dipped his blade into the fog of London's Whitechapel, there was another butcher who stalked the warm, cedar-scented nights of Texas. A man, or something pretending to be one, who crept like a ghost through unlocked doors, walked over creaking floorboards without making a sound, and left behind bodies so ruined that even the hardened undertakers turned their heads away. This wasn't a story told to scare children, though it certainly could have. This was real. This was history. And it happened in the heart of Texas, long before it called itself weird. Austin, 1884, was a city on the edge of something big. It had gas lights, a booming cotton industry, and a rising population full of promise. But it was still rough around the edges. Dirt roads turned to mud after rain. Wild dogs roamed the alleys at night. Most people lived in wooden houses that creaked with every gust of wind, and the rich kept black servant girls to clean, cook, and quietly disappear when they weren't needed. That's where it began. The first to die was Molly Smith, a black servant girl found brutally murdered in her employer's home on New Year's Eve. She was lying in a pool of blood, her body twisted unnaturally, her skull crushed with what authorities believed was an axe. She'd been dragged out of bed and halfway into the backyard, as if the killer had paused mid-act, admiring their work or deciding what to do next. It was a mess, a nightmare. But in a town where violence wasn't rare, some chalked it up to a random act, a fluke, a one-off. It wasn't. Eliza Shelley was the next to die, just 5 months later. Her body was discovered the same way. Mutilated, dragged out of the house, dumped like trash in the yard. Again, no one heard a sound. Not the children sleeping in the next room, not the neighbors, not the dogs. Then came Irene Cross, and things started to feel personal. She wasn't just murdered, she was hacked apart. The medical examiner couldn't even count how many times she'd been struck. They said her face had been ripped to pieces, as if the killer had gone beyond killing and into erasing. And the city? The city began to sweat. Whispers slithered through the streets like smoke. The newspapers, now printing in blood ink headlines, began calling it a series. The term serial killer hadn't been coined yet, but that's what it was. Even if they didn't know it, they could feel it. In total, 8 people were butchered between 1884 and 1885, almost all of them women. Most were black servant girls. Some were dragged through windows. Others had sheets wrapped around their faces. One had a fence post rammed through her chest, pinning her to the earth, like some horrific flagpole. Another was found with a knife still lodged in her skull, handle sticking out like a grotesque candle on a birthday cake of bone. The killer left no footprints, no witnesses, no sounds, just blood, just ruin. As the months dragged on, panic set in. White families began forcing their servants to sleep indoors, on the floor outside their bedroom doors like human alarms. Guns were kept cocked by nightstands. Torches burned until dawn. Men patrolled the neighborhoods in clumsy groups, rifles in one hand and bottles of whiskey in the other. But the killer? He didn't care. He didn't stop. And then came December of 1885. It was Christmas week when 2 white women, Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, were killed on the same night. One was found in her own backyard, head bashed in with a brick. The other was left naked, legs spread, a wooden stake driven into her brain so hard it had sunk into the ground beneath her. That was the tipping point. Suddenly the newspapers screamed. The politicians swore vengeance. The city declared war, not on poverty, not on crime, but on the darkness itself. Police arrested suspects at random, poor black men, vagrants, strangers passing through town. One man, a cook named Maurice, was convicted and sentenced to death, even though he had no connection to any of the victims. Another suspect was held for months before being released with an apology and a broken spirit. Some say the cops knew. They had no clue who was behind it. Others say they were trying to calm the mob. Either way, it didn't matter, because after those final killings, it all stopped. No more murders, no more blood, no more sounds in the night. The servant girl annihilator vanished as suddenly as he had come, like a phantom, like a fever that had broken. But the questions lingered, and still do. Who was he? Some say it was a local butcher with a taste for blood and madness. Others believed it was a physician who experimented on the living. The most haunting theory? That he left Austin, boarded a ship, and landed in London 3 years later, where he changed his name and became someone else entirely. Jack the Ripper. Too many coincidences. The same surgical precision, the same hatred for women, the same boldness, killing in plain sight, near, sleeping husbands right beneath windows and still vanishing like smoke. Of course, it was never proven, but some of the old homes in Austin, the ones still standing from the 1880s, have floors that creak in strange ways. Neighbors report lights flickering, dogs whimpering at certain corners of certain yards. A few even say they've seen a figure in a long coat and bowler hat standing motionless beneath the moonlight, right where the last bodies were found. Maybe it's just history. Or maybe some monsters don't die. They just wait. It was the kind of town you'd forget if you blinked. A dusty stretch of road just south of San Antonio where the sun cooked the dirt hard and flat, and the only thing louder than the freight trains was the silence that followed a scream. Elmendorf, Texas. One gas station, one church, and one place to drink, a bar called the Sociable Inn, run by a man who wasn't exactly sociable at all. His name was Joe Ball, but folks around there called him the Alligator Man. He stood 6 feet tall, built like a slab of smoked meat with cold, unreadable eyes under a slouch hat and a way of talking that made you feel like you'd already agreed to something you didn't understand. They say he'd been a bootlegger during Prohibition, running illegal hooch across county lines in the back of a busted Ford with sawed-off barrels and blood in the trunk. But when the liquor laws loosened, Joe Ball went legit. Or at least Texas legit. He opened the Sociable Inn, a low-ceilinged joint with sticky floors, cheap beer, and prettier girls behind the bar than Elmendorf had any business hiring. He built a little stage, brought in a jukebox, and added one extra attraction out back behind the bar, past a locked gate and a weathered sign that read, "Danger Gators." Yes, real ones. 5 full-grown American alligators in a steel-reinforced pit, thrashing and snapping beneath the South Texas sun. Joe said he got them from a buddy in Louisiana, said they kept the kids away, said they were his version of pest control. But some folks say he smiled too wide when he watched them eat. At first, no one asked questions. Joe Ball was quiet, polite in a stiff sort of way, and paid his bills on time. But the girls he hired, pretty things from San Antonio or Corpus or just a little too far from home, they didn't seem to stay very long. A waitress named Minnie Gotthard disappeared one afternoon, just didn't show up for her shift. Joe shrugged. She probably ran off with a trucker, he said, flipping a rag over his shoulder. Nobody pressed. Then a barmaid named Hazel Brown stopped showing up. No goodbye, no suitcase, just gone. Then, another. Whispers started bubbling in the corners of the bar. Folks said they'd seen Joe dragging something heavy in the middle of the night, that he kept a meat grinder in the back, bigger than he needed, that the gators were getting fed more than just chicken scraps and spoiled beef. And still, nothing was done, because back then in a place like Elmendorf, if a woman disappeared, well, maybe she'd ask for it. Maybe she was wild. Maybe she just wasn't worth looking for. Joe Ball counted on that. The truth came out like a slow leak. A drunk, an ex-employee, a snitch, and finally, a tip to the Bexar County Sheriff's Department. When two deputies showed up one humid afternoon in 1938, Joe was behind the bar cleaning a shotgun. They asked a few questions. Joe answered with a calmness that made the sweat on their necks go cold. And then, without warning, he pulled a pistol from under the bar, pressed it to his chest, and fired. The shot echoed like a thunderclap through the empty barroom. Joe Ball hit the floor, stone dead, eyes wide open as if he'd just seen something worse than death. The deputies, rattled and covered in blood, began the search. What they found was straight out of a nightmare. Behind the bar, in the dirt yard by the gator pit, they found blood-stained tools, a barrel full of rotting flesh and a pile of bones too clean to be from livestock. In a storage shed, shoes, hair, jewelry, bits of clothing, teeth. Joe's handyman, a drifter named Clifford Wheeler, broke under pressure. He admitted to helping Joe get rid of things. Said Joe would get drunk, real quiet-like, and talk about how gators will eat anything, even the parts nobody finds. He said Hazel had begged Joe to let her go, that Joe shot her anyway, said he watched him feed pieces of her to the gators one by one, like he was feeding scraps to a dog. And Minnie? Joe buried her out by the tool, shed what was left of her. They exhumed several graves. They couldn't even count how many victims. Some believe it was 5, others say 20. Some believe he killed far more. Women who had no names, no family, no voice, ground up and swallowed by the gators under a fat Texas moon. They buried Joe Ball in San Antonio. His grave is simple. No headstone, just a slab of concrete. The sociable inn burned down in the 1940s, and the gator pit? It's gone, covered now by weeds and barbed wire. But sometimes, on humid nights, locals say they hear splashing from that empty lot, or the sound of a woman sobbing in the dark, cut short by something that ends in a wet crunch. And the gators? Who knows? Maybe they're gone, or maybe there's something else beneath that Texas dirt, waiting, watching, and remembering every soft scream it was ever fed, because in Elmendorf they still say one thing: don't date a man who keeps gators. Not a monstrous one, not the stuff of fangs and fire and wrinkled claws. No, true evil wears a human smile. It lights a cigarette with steady hands and looks you right in the eye. Kenneth McDuff had that kind of face, not handsome, not ugly, just normal, the kind you'd forget after 5 minutes, which made him deadlier than most demons. He was born in 1946, the son of a concrete contractor, and a woman who loved him too much. Mama McDuff used to call him her angel, said he was special, touched by God, spoiled him rotten, and maybe that's where it all started. Or maybe it started in the dark spots of his brain that never lit up, not even when he laughed. That's why, the time he was 16, folks in Rosebud, Texas already whispered his name like a bad word. He liked to pick fights with younger boys, smash animals with bricks, and once, just once, he tied a cat to a board and ran it over with a lawnmower. When asked why, he just shrugged. That shrug, it would become his signature. In 1966, McDuff was 19, big, dumb, and angry at the world. That's when he met Roy Dale Green, a kid 2 years younger, more scared than mean. McDuff had a way of pulling people in, dragging them into the undertow of his madness. One hot August night, the two of them cruised the streets of Everman in McDuff's Plymouth. Looking for trouble like it was a sport, they found it in the form of 3 teenagers parked by a gravel pit: Edna Sullivan, 16, Robert Brand, 17, and Mark Dunham, 15. Just kids sharing cokes and talking about records and weekend plans. McDuff walked up with a pistol and that same damn shrug. He ordered the boys to lie face down in the dirt. Then he shot them both, one by one, like they were nothing. Roy watched, too scared to move. When it came to Edna, McDuff took her out farther into the woods and raped her. Then, and this is the part that gets people decades later, he took a broomstick and choked her to death with it. Not a rope, not a gun, a broomstick, something your grandma might use to clean up dust bunnies, turned into an execution tool in the hands of a monster. They caught him, eventually. The state gave him the death penalty, and for 20 years, it seemed justice had done its job. The world moved on, the families buried their children, and Kenneth McDuff sat on death row like a rabid dog in a cage until 1989, a bureaucratic miracle. Texas, drowning in overcrowded prisons, decided to reclassify certain inmates. A parole board, some say bribed, others say just criminally stupid, reviewed McDuff's file and called him rehabilitated. They released him back into the wild like some stray mutt. Imagine that. A man who murdered 3 kids with casual cruelty, given a second chance. He stepped out of prison like a ghost re-entering the world. And almost immediately, the killings started again. This time, it was women, waitresses, cashiers, girls working the night shift at gas stations, motel clerks, hitchhikers. They disappeared like mist, gone without a sound, without a sign. The bodies surfaced later, if they surfaced at all. Some were found with their skulls caved in. Others had ligature marks on their necks, as if he used extension cords or pantyhose. One woman was found in a gravel quarry, her hands tied behind her back, her eyes wide open in terror. Another was buried in a shallow grave behind a car wash, with her underwear stuffed down her throat. He was no longer using a broomstick. He didn't need to. He was the weapon. The FBI got involved. The Texas Rangers came knocking. But McDuff was slippery. He changed cars, used fake names, moved between towns like a snake slipping through tall grass. In 1992, the tide turned. A woman named Colleen Reed, an accountant from Austin, vanished from a car wash. Witnesses said she was pulled into a car by a man with a heavy jaw and dead eyes. The media picked up the story. Soon, America's Most Wanted aired a segment on McDuff. That was his mistake, getting famous. A tip came from Kansas City, where McDuff had been working under a fake name. When cops raided his motel room, he didn't resist. He sat on the edge of the bed smoking a cigarette. When asked if he was Kenneth McDuff, he blew smoke in their direction and said, "Took you. Long enough." This time, there were no mistakes. He was tried, convicted, and given the death penalty again. On November 17, 1998, he was strapped to a gurney at the Huntsville unit. His last words? "I'm ready to be released." "Release me." They pumped the poison into his veins. No one cried, but in certain Texas towns, Waco, Temple, Fort Worth, folks still talk about him like he's not quite dead. Like his shadow still lingers in the truck stops and gas stations, in the alleys behind 24-hour diners, in the rustle of weeds near the railroad tracks. Because men like Kenneth McDuff don't just die, they stain. And on quiet Sunday mornings, when the air feels a little too still, people still say, "Lock the doors, watch the dark corners, and never trust a man who shrugs when he sees pain." Lake Waco looked like heaven in July. The sun hit the water just right, made it gleam like polished glass. From a distance, it shimmered with the kind of beauty you find on postcards. Something still, something peaceful. But up close, real close, the water smelled like mud and fish guts and old secrets, the kind of place where something could go missing and never be found again. The kind of place that forgets things, but never really forgives. That summer, 3 kids vanished out there. Jill Montgomery, 17, was the golden-haired beauty queen type. Bright, funny, the kind of girl you thought might end up in California one day, smiling in a commercial with perfect teeth. Kenneth Franks, also 17, was her friend, maybe more, depending on who you asked. And Raylene Rice, just 16, had a rougher edge. Streetwise, always watching. They were just kids looking to cool off, laugh a little, maybe sneak a beer and feel immortal for one night. But they didn't come back. When their bodies were found, it wasn't a case of kids gone swimming and getting caught by the undertow. No, it was worse, much worse. They'd been bound with shoelaces, gagged and stabbed over 40 times each. Their throats were cut so deep it nearly decapitated one of them. Someone had made sure they suffered. This wasn't a quick kill. It was personal. It was intimate. It was evil. The news hit Waco like a thunderclap. Parents locked their doors and clutched their children tight. Cops started checking alibis. Rumors flew faster than lightning on a summer night. Satanists, drifters, a serial killer passing through. It was the kind of town where people nodded at each other in the grocery store but didn't really talk. Not anymore. Not after what happened. Eventually, the blame fell on a man named David Wayne Spence, a tattooed ex-con with a bad attitude, and worse friends. He'd done time. He had a temper. He liked to brag. Not the kind of man you wanted in your neighborhood. The cops said he was working with two other guys, the Melendez brothers, Anthony and Gilbert, low-level criminals who would sell their own mother for a pack of smokes and a warm beer. And then there was Munir Deeb, a convenience store owner. With thick glasses and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, Deeb had apparently taken out a life insurance policy on a girl who worked at his store, Gail Kelly, who just so happened to look a whole lot like Jill Montgomery. The theory? Deeb wanted her dead, and he hired Spence to do the job. But Spence, being Spence, got the wrong girl. And then he killed her friends to clean it up. Open and shut, right? Except it wasn't. The evidence was full of holes. No DNA, no fingerprints. Just jailhouse snitches and a shaky bite mark on one of the victims. Bite marks that didn't even match Spence, according to some experts. The Melendez brothers confessed, sure, but their stories kept changing like the Texas wind. Sometimes it was Spence who killed the kids. Sometimes it was Gilbert. Sometimes it was all three. The truth got buried under a pile of contradictions and plea deals. And the cops? They were in a rush. The town was angry, scared. They wanted someone to pay. David Spence went to the death chamber in 1997, protesting his innocence until the very end. "I didn't kill those kids," he said. "God knows that." They strapped him down, pushed the plunger, and that was that. Case closed. But ask around in Waco, especially near the lake, and you'll find people who aren't so sure. They'll tell you about the real killer, a man named Terry Harper, a loner with a violent streak and a knife collection, who bragged about the murders in whispers and barroom mutterings. They'll talk about cops who looked the other way, informants who lied to save their skins, and evidence that just disappeared. They'll tell you that sometimes justice ain't justice at all. It's just revenge with a badge and a courtroom. And the lake? They say it still remembers. That on quiet nights, if you stand on the shore and listen real close, you can hear something move beneath the surface. Something cold. Something old. A ripple that doesn't belong. Like the water itself is uneasy. A fisherman once said he saw a shape under his boat. Thought it was a gator at first. Then he saw a hand, a pale, bloated hand, just reaching toward the surface, then gone. No one knows if David Spence was innocent. Maybe he was a killer, maybe he wasn't. But the thing is, someone did it, and if it wasn't him, then the real monster's still out there, watching the water, waiting. There's a stretch of land off I-45 that runs like a scar down southeast Texas. Locals call it the Killing Fields. Not officially, of course. That kind of name doesn't look good on brochures, and realtors don't much care for haunted property lines. But everyone who's lived there long enough, folks in League City, Webster, even up in Houston, they all know what it means. It's flat, swampy land mostly. Cheap dirt. Hard pan in summer, soggy and snake-thick in the rainy season. Power. Lines sag overhead like dead nerves. Oil derricks groan in the distance. There's a chemical stink in the air that never quite goes away, no matter how hard the wind blows. And God help you if you're a girl alone out there after dark. The first ones to vanish were just whispers. A waitress from a roadside diner in 71. A teenage hitchhiker with a broken sandal in 73. A little girl, just 12, gone walking her dog one July afternoon and never came back. Her mutt returned hours later, wet with creek water and shaking like a leaf. Then came the bones. They started turning up in the late 70s, poking through the cracked mud like fingers trying to claw their way back to the world. The cops would come, throw up yellow tape, dig a little. Another girl, always another girl. Sometimes they'd find jewelry, a cheap locket, a class ring still wrapped around a knucklebone. Sometimes they didn't even find a skull. You'd think, after a few of those discoveries, they'd shut the place down, fence it off, dig it up, bulldoze it to hell, but they didn't. Couldn't. It was private land, see? Bought and sold a dozen times over by developers and ranchers, all of them claiming ignorance, and the murders didn't stop. You see, this wasn't a single killer's playground. It was a damn carnival of carnage, a showcase of evil. The cops suspected a drifter at first, then a trucker, then some ex-con from Pasadena. DNA got involved in the 2000s, but by then, the damage was already done. What they started to realize, too late like always, is that this wasn't the work of one madman. It was many, some working in the same years, some decades apart, different methods, different trophies. One liked to tie his victims with baling wire, another took their shoes, a third left little piles of rocks on the bodies like some kind of twisted prayer. But the end result was the same: girls, dead and discarded like garbage, left to rot in the marshland while the sun beat down and the buzzards circled overhead. There's a theory among the locals. They say that part of I-45 is cursed, like truly god-awfully cursed, a black wound in the earth. Some say it's the burial ground of a tribe wiped out centuries ago. Others whisper about devil-worshipping cults in the pine woods. One old man, a gas station clerk named Hollis, with more tobacco stains than teeth, swears he saw something once back in '79. Says he saw a pale man standing in the reeds at sunset, smiling, naked as the day he was born. Said the man's eyes were just two pits, black as crude oil. Hollis never went back to that part of the field, not even to bury his dog when she died. And the thing is, the killings haven't stopped. They've just slowed down, gotten smarter, more careful. The bodies don't always turn up anymore. They disappear into the mud or into the ocean beyond Galveston Bay. Girls still vanish, sometimes kids, sometimes tourists, sometimes mothers out running errands who take a wrong turn and end up somewhere they shouldn't be. There was one girl, Maria Vasquez, 17. Went missing in 2012. Her car was found a week later, engine still warm, doors locked from the inside. The driver's seat soaked in something sticky and dark. No one's seen her since, and 2 years after that, a couple of hunters found her bracelet in the dirt, still clasped around a wrist bone. Here's the part that keeps me up at night, friend. You could park your car on the shoulder of I-45 and walk straight into that field. You'd see nothing but grass, telephone poles, and maybe a water tower in the distance. You'd hear birds, the whine of mosquitoes, and the rustling wind. But if you listen close, really close, you might hear something else. Breathing, or crying, or the wind carrying a girl's voice begging you to help her. Don't go looking. Don't be a hero. This place doesn't want heroes, because the evil here, it's not just in men, it's in the land. The soil has soaked up too much blood and it likes the taste. Something ancient lives beneath those fields, something that listens and waits and hungers. So if you're ever driving the I-45 corridor at night and see a figure walking by the roadside, long hair, torn jeans, maybe thumbing a ride, keep going. Don't stop, because the Texas killing fields don't give back what they take. Not whole, anyway. He rode the rails like a ghost with a thirst for blood. Not the kind of ghost that haunts old houses or lingers in graveyards, but the kind that moves fast and leaves nothing but death behind. Angel Maturino Resendez was his name, and from the shadows of the 1990s Texas night, he slipped in and out of towns like a bad dream you couldn't shake. Freight trains were his horses, the steel rails his highways, and the towns along those tracks were his hunting grounds. Wherever the iron serpent twisted through sleepy towns and open plains, Angel was never far behind. The people who disappeared near the tracks didn't vanish quietly. Their deaths echoed like thunder in the empty houses where they once lived. He didn't use guns or knives, tools too noisy or too messy. His weapon was the hammer or whatever heavy object he could get. His hands on, a brutal instrument of raw violence. The sound of a hammer striking flesh and bone was a sickening, hollow thud, the kind of sound that carved terror into the hearts of anyone who heard it. But no one ever heard Angel coming. They only heard the silence afterward. He broke into homes nestled close to the rails in the dead of night, slipping through windows left unlocked or doors left ajar by careless residents. Inside, the world was quiet, the only light from the moon casting long shadows across faded wallpaper and dusty furniture. He moved like a shadow himself, slipping through bedrooms and living rooms, searching. And when he found his victims, the quiet was shattered forever. His blows were sudden and savage, shattering skulls, crushing bones, leaving faces and bodies so mangled that some victims had to be identified by dental records. The police, baffled and horrified, called him the Railroad Killer because every crime scene was near the tracks, every death a whispered warning carried by the wind across the Texas plains. Resendez wasn't just a killer. He claimed to be a messenger, a divine instrument. He said God sent him to punish sinners, to cleanse the world with blood and bone. His gospel was one of violence, and his mission was relentless. He believed the victims deserved their fate. Some townsfolk whispered that he was possessed, that the evil clung to him like a second skin. Rail workers swore they could hear footsteps on empty boxcars long after midnight, the creak of chains and the faint whistle of a train that no one saw coming. Some said they saw a pale figure riding the rails, his face hidden beneath a weathered hat, eyes dark and empty as the Texas sky. Others said he was more than a man, a curse on steel wheels, a shadow that could never be outrun. The fear he inspired wasn't just because of the violence, but because of the way he vanished without a trace. By dawn, he was gone. No footprints, no witnesses, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The rail lines ran like veins through the heart of Texas, and Angel Maturino Resendez rode them like death itself, slipping through towns with the ease of smoke through a cracked window. He was a ghost with a hammer, and wherever he went, the earth seemed to shudder beneath the weight of his sins. His killing spree stretched across the state in the late 1990s, leaving families shattered and communities haunted by the memory of those who disappeared without a trace. The police were baffled, chasing shadows that slipped between jurisdictions and vanished before they could be caught. But Angel was reckless too, and his violent nature eventually gave him away. His capture was as surreal as his crimes. Man walking across a bridge, his face calm and unreadable, surrendering as if he were tired of the blood and the chase. The trial that followed was grim and cold, filled with details so horrific they made headlines but never told the full story of the terror he spread. Convicted and sentenced to death, Angel Maturino Resendez was executed in Huntsville prison, but the darkness he brought with him refused to die. Rail workers, those weathered men who have spent their lives riding the rails and maintaining the steel arteries of the country, still swear they hear him. The sound of footsteps echoing across empty boxcars late at night. The faint tapping of a hammer against steel, a shadow glimpsed out of the corner of the eye. Some say he waits, riding the rails forever, an unquiet spirit bound to the iron tracks, and the blood they carry. The wind along the tracks sometimes carries a strange whisper, the echo of a gospel twisted by violence, a song sung by a man who believed he was an angel but was only death wearing a battered coat and a rusted hat. They weren't from Texas, but they left their mark here like a stain that refuses to fade. Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck, names that slid through the newspapers in the 1940s, whispered behind closed doors and in church basements where women gathered, clutching rosaries and praying for peace they'd never find. It was a twisted love story, but love had long since turned sour, turned violent, a poison that dripped from their hands. Raymond was the kind of man who wore a smile like armor. His slicked back hair and smooth voice could charm the devil himself. He had a way with words, a tongue dipped in honey and razor blades. He found his victims in the personals pages, lonely women desperate for connection, women who thought a letter might bring salvation or a new life. They opened their hearts, their doors, and welcomed a stranger in. That stranger was Raymond, and with him came Martha. Martha was the shadow behind Raymond's smile. A nurse by training, but with eyes cold as ice and a heart that burned with jealousy and rage. She wasn't just his partner, she was his enforcer, the brutal hand that kept their dark romance fueled with blood and violence. Where Raymond whispered sweet nothings, Martha delivered brutal truths. If a woman looked too close, if she threatened to pull Raymond away, Martha made sure she never got the chance. In Elmendorf, Texas, the nightmare hit close to home. A quiet bungalow sat at the edge of town, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and every porch light stayed lit until midnight. But that night, the bungalow became a house of horrors. Raymond and Martha crept inside under the cover of darkness, their steps silent as death itself. The woman who lived there didn't know what waited for her, the twisted fate that would turn her life into a grotesque tableau of fear and pain. She was strangled first, the pressure of hands tightening around her throat until the light faded from her eyes. But the killing was only the beginning. They dismembered her, chopping her apart piece by piece. The neighbors didn't know the details at first, only the smell, that horrible, sickening stench like death boiling on a stove that seeped through the walls and windows. It clung to the air, settling into the cracks in the floorboards, a ghostly reminder of the violence that had stained their quiet town. Raymond and Martha moved on, slipping through the shadows, traveling from Texas to Michigan, dragging a bloody trail behind them like the tail of some monstrous comet. Each town they touched became a little darker, a little more afraid. Women locked their doors tight, husbands kept watch through cracked curtains, and children learned not to answer the phone at night. The personal ads still ran in the newspapers, but now they were tainted with fear. A dark game of Russian roulette played with strangers' lives. The police struggled to catch them. Raymond was slippery, a man who changed names and faces like a magician swaps cards. Martha was fierce and silent, always lurking behind the scenes, a vengeful spirit ready to strike. But every time the net tightened, they slipped through, ghosts riding freight trains, hitchhiking across state lines. They were a nightmare that no amount of law enforcement could outrun. It wasn't just their murders that left the deepest scars. It was the way they toyed with their victims, the calculated cruelty, the promises made then broken, the way Raymond's charm twisted into a weapon of manipulation. Martha's jealousy wasn't just personal, it was a brutal force, a warning that love turned dark could become a cage of pain and blood. When the law finally caught them, it was like the air in the towns they'd terrorized was sucked out. Families who had lost daughters and sisters finally had names to put on the nightmare. The trial was cold and grim, the courtroom filled with faces etched in sorrow and anger. But even behind bars, Raymond and Martha never lost their grip on fear. Their legacy clung to the walls of every home they'd touched, a greasy residue of terror that no amount of sunlight could wash away. People say the house in Elmendorf still smells like death, that if you stand close to the old bungalow, the wind carries whispers, broken promises and shattered dreams, the echoes of a love that burned too hot and left only ash. The butcher of Elmendorf, they called them. But the real horror was how love itself had been twisted into a weapon, a curse that haunted every lonely heart, whoever dared to reach out for connection. And in the dark, when the night is thick and heavy, some say you can still hear Martha's footsteps, slow, deliberate, like a nurse coming to check on a patient long dead, and Raymond's voice, silky and cruel, whispering lies meant to trap you forever. In Arlington, Texas, in the mid-1990s, the city pulsed with normal life. Kids played in the streets, stores buzzed with neon lights, and people moved in and out of their apartments like any other place in America. But beneath that ordinary rhythm, beneath the hum of traffic and the chatter of neighbors, something darker was unfolding. Something so quiet, so precise, that it slipped past the radar of even the sharpest eyes. The first body was found on a icy, crisp autumn morning in 1996. The victim, a young woman named Linda, lived alone in a modest apartment complex on the edge of town. Her neighbors barely knew her. She kept to herself, worked nights at a diner, and came home tired, locking the door behind her. That morning, her landlord knocked because her rent was overdue. When she didn't answer, he used the spare key to enter. What he saw stopped him cold. Linda lay in her bathtub, fully clothed, her pale face tilted toward the ceiling, eyes open, but lifeless. The water was still and clear, just enough to cover her shoulders. No signs of struggle, no indication of how she died. The door was locked from the inside, the windows shut tight against the chill. No footprints on the carpet, no overturned furniture. It was like the apartment was a sealed tomb, death itself gently resting on the porcelain rim of that bathtub. The police were baffled. The coroner's report was even more disturbing. No water in her lungs. No apparent cause of death other than drowning, but no explanation for how water got inside without her inhaling any. No evidence of poison or drugs, no signs of trauma. It was as if she had simply slipped underwater and stopped breathing, but without the panic or noise one would expect. It was impossible and terrifying. Months passed, and life in Arlington tried to forget. But then came the second body, found 2 years later, almost the exact same way, in another apartment a few blocks away. This time the victim was older, a single mother named Carol. Her neighbors had heard nothing, no cries, no screams, just the quiet sound of water dripping from the faucet she'd left running. The police found her the same way, drowned in the bathtub, the apartment locked from the inside, clean and untouched, except for the silent horror in the water. Rumors started to swirl. People whispered about a ghost, a specter who slipped through, locked doors, and claimed victims without a sound. They called him the Bathtub Killer, though no one knew if he was a man or something darker, something not quite human. Detectives worked tirelessly but found no leads, no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints beyond the victims, no witnesses. The killer left no prints on the door, no signs of breaking and entering, no forced windows. How did he get in? How did he drown these women without a sound? It was a puzzle that ate away at their sanity. Then the name Devon Scheanette came up, a quiet man who lived nearby, working odd jobs and keeping to himself. No criminal record, no known enemies. Just a ghost in the crowd, unnoticed, unremarkable. But when the police searched his apartment, they found something chilling. A key ring with copies of many apartment keys from the complex. Keys that should not have been duplicated. His movements matched the times of the deaths, though no one could explain how he got into the locked apartments without noise or struggle. Neighbors remembered hearing strange things. A faucet running in the dead of night, the faint sound of footsteps in empty hallways, the soft creak of a door, just barely opening then closing again, but no one dared to confront it. Fear is a silencing thing, and in Arlington people locked their doors tight and prayed. Dale never spoke much during the investigation, but when pressed, he gave chilling answers. He claimed it wasn't him, claimed something else entered the apartments, something dark, something he couldn't control. He said he was chosen, marked by something ancient, a presence that demanded death in the quietest way possible. The trial was a shadow show of whispered accusations and silent horrors. Dale was convicted, but the silence he left behind was louder than any verdict. People said they still heard water dripping in the night, faucets turning on by themselves, doors locking and unlocking with no one there. Some nights, in the dark corners of Arlington, you can almost hear the faint splash of water, the soft sigh of someone holding their breath underwater, waiting for the silence to swallow them whole. And the apartments? They still stand, empty more often than not, the windows staring like dead eyes. No one wants to live where death soaked. In silence, where the bathtub killer's ghost still waits in the stillness, locked inside a room with no escape,